What if the very thing you thought was keeping you safe is actually the thing quietly destroying you? Right now, in this moment, your mind is running a program you never agreed to. You call it being careful. You call it being thorough. You call it just wanting to make the right decision. But what if I told you that what you call thinking is actually a slow, invisible war being waged against your own confidence, your own peace, your own life? Overthinking doesn't feel dangerous. That's exactly why it's so effective. It disguises itself as responsibility. It wears the mask of intelligence. It convinces you that if you just replay the conversation one more time, if you just consider one more possibility, if you just wait a little longer before deciding, you'll finally arrive at clarity. But clarity never comes. Because overthinking isn't designed to give you answers. It's designed to keep you exactly where you are. This isn't a video about relaxing more or thinking less. This is about understanding the actual mechanism that is draining your confidence every single day without your permission. And, more importantly, how to dismantle it completely. By the end of this video, you will understand why your brain does this to you, what it's costing you, that you can't even see yet, and exactly how to take your mind back. Here's the part that should unsettle you. The people you admire, the ones who seem calm under pressure, the ones who make decisions without spiraling, the ones who walk into a room and simply exist without apologizing for it, they are not smarter than you. They are not luckier than you. They have simply stopped feeding the loop that you are still trapped inside of. And once you understand how that loop works, you will never see your own mind the same way again. So let's begin. Because the version of you that trusts their own decisions, that sleeps peacefully at night, that speaks without rehearsing every word 10 times in their head, that version of you already exists. They are just buried under years of noise. It's time to dig them out. This is not a lecture about willpower. And it's not going to end with a vague suggestion to think positive. Every idea in this video is built to be applied, not just understood. You will walk away with a clear picture of the mechanism running underneath your hesitation and a practical way to interrupt it. Starting with decisions as small as what to say next in a conversation, all the way up to the ones that shape the entire direction of your life. Stay with this from beginning to end, because each chapter builds on the last, and by the time you reach the final one, the loop that has quietly run your life for years will no longer feel invisible. It will feel optional. Chapter 1. The lie that overthinking is keeping you safe. Somewhere along the way, you were taught to believe that thinking more equals deciding better. That if you just turn a problem over enough times in your mind, you will eventually land on the perfect answer. This belief feels so reasonable that almost no one ever questions it. But it is one of the most costly lies you will ever accept about yourself. Overthinking is not thinking. Thinking is a tool. It has a purpose, a beginning, and an end. You use it to weigh options, gather information, and arrive at a decision. Overthinking has no end. It is not a tool, it is a loop. It takes the same handful of fears and doubts and runs them through your mind again and again, dressed up in slightly different language each time, so it feels like progress. It isn't. It's your brain pretending to work while actually avoiding the one thing it fears most: commitment. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Overthinking is not caution. It is fear, wearing a disguise, so convincing that you mistake it for wisdom. Think about the last time you replayed a conversation in your head, searching for a hidden meaning in something someone said. Did that replay protect you from anything? Did it change the outcome? Or did it simply cost you hours of peace while producing nothing except more anxiety? The reason this lie is so powerful is because overthinking gives you the sensation of control. As long as you are still turning a decision over in your mind, you haven't committed to anything, which means you haven't risked being wrong yet. Your brain treats this unfinished state as a kind of safety, but it's a false safety. Because life doesn't pause while you deliberate. Opportunities close. Relationships stagnate. Confidence erodes. All while you're congratulating yourself for being thorough. Consider two people faced with the same decision. Whether to speak up in a meeting, whether to ask someone out, whether to leave a job that no longer serves them. One person feels the fear, acknowledges it, and moves forward anyway, adjusting course as new information arrives. The other person feels the same fear, but instead of acting, begins the loop. What if I say the wrong thing? What if they say no? What if I regret it? What if I don't regret it? And that means something is wrong with me for waiting so long. Notice something about that second spiral. It never actually reaches a conclusion. It just keeps generating new questions to avoid the discomfort of an answer. This is what makes overthinking so different from genuine reflection. Genuine reflection moves toward a decision. Overthinking moves away from one while pretending to approach it. It is a trick your mind plays on you. And once you see the trick clearly, you can never fully believe the lie again. There's a reason this pattern takes hold so easily. Your brain is wired to avoid pain more urgently than it is wired to seek reward. Making a decision means risking a wrong outcome, and a wrong outcome means potential embarrassment, loss, or regret. Your brain, in its outdated attempt to protect you, decides that no decision is safer than a bad one. So it keeps you circling the problem indefinitely, mistaking paralysis for protection. But paralysis is not protection. It's just a slower, quieter form of loss, one that doesn't announce itself the way failure does, which is exactly why it's so much easier to ignore until years have gone by. This is also why overthinking so often targets exactly the decisions that matter most to you. It's not random. The more emotionally significant a decision is, the more your brain treats the associated uncertainty as high stakes, and the harder it works to delay commitment through endless review. That's why you can decide what to order at a restaurant in seconds but spend weeks unable to decide whether to have a difficult conversation with someone you love. The stakes aren't actually higher in some objective sense that justifies weeks over seconds. Your brain has simply attached more perceived danger to the emotionally loaded decision. And danger, real or imagined, is what triggers the loop. Once you understand that overthinking was never actually protecting you, something shifts. You stop respecting the loop. You stop treating every anxious replay as useful information and start recognizing it for what it actually is. Noise your mind generates to avoid the vulnerability of committing to something real. And the moment you stop respecting the noise, it starts to lose its grip on you. There's another layer to this lie worth exposing, and it has to do with identity. Somewhere along the way, many people who overthink begin to wear it as a badge of intelligence. They tell themselves that thorough people consider every angle, that smart people don't act impulsively, that careful people examine a decision from every possible direction before committing. This story feels flattering, which is exactly why it's so hard to release. Nobody wants to give up a narrative that makes their struggle sound like a virtue. But look closely at the outcomes this so-called virtue actually produces. Does the constant deliberation lead to noticeably better decisions than the ones made by people who trust themselves and move? Or does it simply lead to the same decisions arrived at later, with far more suffering along the way, and sometimes not arrived at all because the window closed while the analysis was still running? Consider also how selectively this supposed thoroughness gets applied. The same person who spends 3 hours agonizing over how to phrase a single text message will often make far more consequential decisions: what to eat, what to watch, which route to drive, without a second thought. This inconsistency reveals something important. If overthinking were truly about being careful and rigorous, it would show up proportionally, applied most heavily to the decisions that matter most. Instead, it shows up wherever fear of judgment or fear of being wrong happens to be loudest, regardless of the actual stakes involved. That's not diligence. That's anxiety, borrowing the language of diligence to justify its presence. It's worth sitting with a simple, almost uncomfortable question. What has your overthinking actually earned you? Not what it has protected you from in your imagination, but what concrete benefit it has delivered in reality. For most people, when they honestly interrogate this question for the first time, the answer is unsettling. The overthinking rarely prevented the mistake it promised to prevent. It rarely produced the certainty it promised to produce. What it did produce, reliably and repeatedly, was delay, exhaustion, and a growing distrust of one's own mind. Once you see this clearly, the lie loses its final foothold, because a lie can only survive as long as it remains unexamined. Chapter 2. The silent erosion of your confidence. Confidence is not built or destroyed in a single dramatic moment. It is built or destroyed in thousands of small, unnoticed moments. And overthinking is one of the most efficient confidence killers because it operates below the threshold of your awareness. You don't notice your confidence shrinking the way you'd notice a wound. It happens the way erosion happens to a coastline. Slowly, quietly, until one day you look at yourself and wonder where all that solid ground went. Every time you overthink a decision instead of making it, you send your own subconscious a message. That message is simple. I don't trust myself. It doesn't matter that you eventually chose something. What matters is the internal experience of hesitation, doubt, and second-guessing that surrounded the choice. Your subconscious doesn't remember the outcome nearly as vividly as it remembers the feeling of not trusting your own judgment. And that feeling compounds. Each time you doubt yourself, you make the next act of self-trust a little harder to access. This is why some people seem to become more confident the more decisions they make, while others become more anxious the more choices life throws at them. It has nothing to do with the number of decisions. It has everything to do with how those decisions were made. A person who commits, acts, and adjusts is training their brain to trust their own judgment. A person who hesitates, spirals, and eventually chooses out of exhaustion rather than clarity is training their brain to distrust itself. Decision after decision, without ever realizing that's what's happening. Think about how this plays out in ordinary life. You want to speak up with an idea in a meeting, but you run it through your head so many times, questioning whether it's good enough, whether people will judge it, whether there's a better way to phrase it, that by the time you've reached a version you're comfortable saying, the moment has passed and someone else has spoken. You tell yourself it wasn't the right time, but your subconscious recorded something different. It recorded that you had something to say and didn't trust yourself enough to say it. Repeat this pattern for years, across meetings, relationships, opportunities, and you end up with a mind fluent in self-doubt because you've been training it in that language every single day. This same pattern shows up in far smaller, almost invisible moments too. Moments so minor, you'd never think to connect them to your overall confidence. Choosing what to say in a text message and rewriting it 6 times before sending. Ordering something at a restaurant and immediately wondering if you should have chosen differently. Deciding on an outfit and changing 3 times before leaving the house. Not because anything is actually wrong with the first choice, but because the mind can't settle on trusting its own preference. None of these moments feel significant in isolation, but your subconscious doesn't grade on a curve for stakes. It simply logs the pattern. This person hesitates, doubts, and revises, over and over, regardless of how small the decision actually is. And a mind that has logged thousands of these small hesitations will show up noticeably less confident in the large, high-stakes moments too, because by then, hesitation has become the default setting rather than the exception. The insidious part is that overthinking often masquerades as humility or thoroughness. So you rarely blame it directly for your lack of confidence. Instead, you blame yourself for being naturally anxious, or naturally indecisive, or naturally not cut out for certain situations. You misdiagnose the cause. You think the problem is who you are, when the actual problem is a habit of mind you've never examined closely enough to challenge. There's also a quieter cost that almost nobody talks about. The confidence you lose in front of yourself when no one else is watching. Every time you overthink whether to start the project, whether to send the message, whether to pursue the goal, and ultimately let the moment pass without acting, you are alone in a room with the evidence. Nobody else witnesses that failure to act, but you do. And that private erosion, repeated enough times, becomes the quiet architecture of low self-worth, built one avoided decision at a time. Here is what makes this reversible, and it's important you understand this clearly. Confidence is not a fixed trait you either have or don't have. It is a byproduct of accumulated evidence that you can trust yourself. Every single time you interrupt the overthinking loop and choose to act, even imperfectly, you are creating new evidence. You are teaching your nervous system, your subconscious, your entire internal identity, that you are someone who follows through. That evidence accumulates exactly the same way the doubt did, which means the erosion isn't permanent. It's a direction, and directions can be reversed. There's a particular kind of confidence damage that deserves special attention because it's easy to overlook. The confidence you lose in your own perception of reality when you overthink a social interaction for hours, constructing theory after theory about what someone really meant by a comment or a tone of voice. You are training yourself to distrust your own read of situations. You start to believe that your first, immediate perception cannot be trusted, that only after extensive analysis can you arrive at the real truth of what happened. But this is backward. Your immediate perception, formed in real time with full access to tone, context, and body language, is almost always more accurate than the reconstructed version you build hours later from memory, filtered through anxiety and worst-case imagination. Yet, the more you overthink, the more you come to trust the anxious reconstruction over the original, accurate read. This is a specific and painful kind of self-betrayal, because it doesn't just cost you confidence in your decisions, it costs you confidence in your own eyes and ears. This erosion also shows up in how willing you are to take up space in your own life. Confident people ask for what they want, voice disagreement when it matters, and set boundaries without excessive apology, not because they're naturally bold, but because they've built a track record of trusting their own judgment enough to act on it. Someone whose confidence has been worn down by years of overthinking often finds themselves doing the opposite in all three areas. They don't ask, because asking requires trusting that their desire is legitimate enough to voice. They don't disagree, because disagreement requires trusting that their perspective deserves airtime. They don't set boundaries, because a boundary requires trusting your own discomfort is valid without needing to justify it. 6 different ways first. Every one of these hesitations traces back to the same root. A mind that has been taught, through repetition, not to trust itself. The good news buried inside all of this is that the mechanism runs in both directions with equal power. Just as doubt compounds through repetition, trust compounds through repetition too. You don't need a single dramatic act of courage to reverse years of erosion. You need a series of small, repeated moments where you choose to act on your own judgment despite the discomfort of uncertainty, and let the outcome, whatever it is, become new data. Over time, this rebuilds the exact structure that overthinking wore down, not because the mind stops offering doubt, but because you build a stronger and stronger counter-evidence file that makes the doubt easier and easier to override. Chapter 3. What is actually happening inside your brain? To understand why overthinking has such a powerful hold on you, it helps to understand what's happening biologically when the loop kicks in, because this isn't a character flaw. It's a mechanism, and mechanisms can be understood, interrupted, and retrained. When you're faced with an uncertain decision or a socially threatening situation, a small almond-shaped structure deep in your brain called the amygdala activates. Its job is threat detection, and it doesn't distinguish well between a genuine physical danger and the discomfort of, say, sending a text message that might not get the response you want. To your amygdala, uncertainty itself can register as a threat, because uncertainty historically meant unpredictability, and unpredictability once meant potential danger for your ancestors. So your brain treats the unresolved decision the same way it might treat a rustle in the bushes, something to stay alert to until it's resolved. At the same time, a network in your brain, known as the default mode network, becomes highly active during overthinking. This network is responsible for self-referential thought, the kind of thinking where you replay memories, imagine future scenarios, and construct narratives about yourself and how others perceive you. In small doses, this network helps you plan and reflect, but when it becomes overactive, especially in combination with anxiety, it produces exactly the kind of looping, repetitive thought spirals that define overthinking. You start narrating worst-case scenarios, replaying past interactions, searching for hidden failures, and rehearsing conversations that haven't even happened yet. Here's the part that explains why overthinking feels so physically exhausting. Each time your mind spins through one of these loops, your body responds as if the imagined scenario were actually happening. Your amygdala signals a mild threat response. Your body releases cortisol and adrenaline in small but repeated doses. Your heart rate shifts slightly. Your muscles hold tension. This is why after an hour of overthinking a single conversation, you can feel as drained as if you'd actually lived through a stressful confrontation, even though nothing external happened at all. Your nervous system doesn't fully distinguish between the imagined threat and a real one. It responds to both. Over time, if this pattern repeats often enough, something even more concerning happens. Neural pathways associated with anxious, looping thought become stronger and more efficient, simply because they are used so frequently. This is the basic principle of neuroplasticity. Whatever pathway you activate most often becomes the path of least resistance. If you spend years defaulting to overthinking every decision, your brain becomes remarkably efficient at overthinking. It's not that you're broken, it's that you've unintentionally trained your brain to be exceptionally good at a pattern that hurts you. There's also a hormonal feedback loop worth understanding, because it explains why overthinking tends to get worse the longer a single episode continues, rather than better. Cortisol, released during the early stages of a stress response, is useful in short bursts, sharpening focus and readiness. But sustained release, the kind produced by an hour or more of continuous mental spiraling, begins to impair the very cognitive functions you need to actually resolve the situation. Working memory narrows. Cognitive flexibility, your ability to consider a problem from a fresh angle rather than the same worn groove, decreases. This creates a cruel irony. The longer you overthink something, the less biologically capable your brain becomes of actually thinking your way to a good answer, even though the felt urge to keep analyzing only grows stronger. The solution was never further inside the loop. It was outside of it. This is actually the most hopeful part of the science, even though it might not sound like it at first. If overthinking is a trained pattern reinforced through repetition, then it can be retrained the same way. Just as the pathway towards spiraling thought was built through repeated use, a pathway toward calm, decisive thinking can be built the exact same way, through repeated, deliberate practice. Your brain is not fixed. It is constantly being shaped by what you practice, whether or not you're doing it on purpose, which means the moment you start practicing something different, even in small ways, you begin physically rewiring the very mechanism that's been working against you. Understanding this changes the emotional relationship you have with your own overthinking. It stops being a mysterious personal failure and starts being a pattern with an identifiable cause and, more importantly, an identifiable solution. You are not weak for overthinking. You are simply running a well-practiced program. And well-practiced programs can be replaced with better ones. There's a second piece of brain science worth understanding here, because it explains why simply trying to think your way out of overthinking almost never works. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational analysis, long-term planning, and impulse control, sits in a delicate balance with the amygdala and its threat detection response. Under normal circumstances, the prefrontal cortex can regulate and calm an activated amygdala, essentially telling it, "This isn't a real threat. You can stand down." But when anxiety and stress hormones reach a certain threshold, that regulatory relationship weakens. The amygdala effectively becomes louder than the prefrontal cortex can compensate for. Which means the very tool you're trying to use to think your way to calm, your rational mind, is operating with reduced authority over the anxious signal driving the loop in the first place. This is precisely why telling an overthinker to just calm down or just stop worrying so rarely works. You're asking a system to self-regulate using the exact channel that's currently being outvoted. This also explains why physical interventions are often more effective at interrupting a spiral than purely mental ones, because the amygdala's threat response is deeply tied to the body. Slow, controlled breathing, physical movement, cold exposure, and changes in posture can directly influence the nervous system state that's fueling the loop, sometimes far more efficiently than trying to reason your way out of it. This isn't a replacement for addressing the underlying pattern, but it explains why stepping outside for a walk or taking several slow breaths before making a decision can genuinely quiet a spiral that no amount of additional analysis ever could. There is also a well-documented phenomenon called rumination, distinct from ordinary worry, that researchers have studied extensively because of its strong link to anxiety and low mood. Rumination is characterized by repetitive, passive focus on the causes and consequences of distress, without any accompanying problem-solving or action. It's the mental equivalent of picking at a wound instead of treating it. The critical insight from this research is that rumination doesn't just fail to solve problems. It actively worsens mood and increases the perceived severity of whatever is being ruminated on. In other words, the more you turn a worry over in your mind without acting, the worse and more threatening that worry will start to feel. Not because the underlying situation changed, but because repetition itself amplifies emotional intensity. This is why a decision that felt only mildly uncomfortable in the morning can feel unbearable by midnight, purely as a result of how many times it's been mentally replayed, not because anything about the decision itself has changed. Chapter 4. How overthinking quietly destroys your peace of mind. Confidence is only half of what overthinking steals from you. The other half, and in many ways the more painful half, is your peace of mind. Because even in moments where nothing is actively going wrong in your life, overthinking manufactures a constant undercurrent of unease that never fully lets you rest. Notice how overthinking rarely stays contained to a single issue. It starts with one unresolved worry, a decision you haven't made, a conversation you're unsure about, a mistake you think you might have made, and it spreads. Your mind, still activated from one loop, starts scanning for other unresolved threads to pull on. Suddenly, you're not just thinking about the email you haven't sent. You're also thinking about that comment your friend made last week, and whether your finances are actually in order, and whether you're falling behind compared to people your age. None of these thoughts are new information. They're old anxieties, resurfacing because your mind is already in a hypervigilant state. And hypervigilance always finds more to worry about once it's switched on. This is why peace of mind feels so elusive to someone caught in a chronic overthinking pattern. It's not that their life is objectively more chaotic than anyone else's. It's that their internal environment offers no true rest. Even in quiet moments, on a walk, in bed at night, during a break at work, the mind keeps working, keeps scanning, keeps replaying. Rest becomes something that happens to the body while the mind continues laboring in the background. And over time, this produces a specific kind of exhaustion that sleep alone cannot fix, because the problem was never a lack of physical rest. It was a lack of mental stillness. Sleep itself becomes one of the first casualties. Nighttime, when external distractions disappear, is when the default mode network has the most room to run unchecked. This is why so many people report their most intense overthinking happening the moment they lie down to sleep. The silence that should invite rest instead becomes an amplifier for every unresolved thought from the day. Hours pass, replaying conversations or rehearsing tomorrow's problems, and what should have been recovery time becomes another arena for the loop to perform in, leaving you exhausted before the day has even begun. Relationships suffer in ways that are often difficult to trace back to their true cause. Someone caught in chronic overthinking often struggles to be fully present with the people in front of them, because part of their attention is always occupied elsewhere, reviewing a past interaction or pre-processing a future one. Loved ones can sense this half-presence even when they can't name it. They notice you nodding along without quite being there. Over time, this creates a subtle distance in relationships that has nothing to do with love or commitment and everything to do with a mind too occupied with its own loops to fully arrive in the present moment with another person. And perhaps the cruelest cost of all is this. Overthinking convinces you that if you just think about your problems a little more, you'll eventually feel better. But peace of mind was never on the other side of more thinking. It was on the other side of trusting yourself enough to stop. Every additional lap around the same worry doesn't bring clarity. It just deepens the groove of anxiety a little further, making the next spiral even easier to fall into. The relief you're chasing through analysis was never available through analysis in the first place. It only ever comes through resolution. And resolution requires the one thing overthinking is specifically designed to avoid: a decision. There's also a subtler form of peace being stolen here, one that has nothing to do with big worries and everything to do with the texture of everyday experience. Think about the last time you ate a meal without your mind wandering to something unresolved. Think about the last time you watched a sunset, or listened to a song, or sat with a friend, and were actually there for the entirety of it, rather than partially present, while some background process kept reviewing yesterday's conversation or pre-living tomorrow's obligations. For someone caught in chronic overthinking, these fully present moments become rare, not because life lacks beauty or stillness, but because the mind has developed a habit of treating stillness itself as an opportunity to resume its work. Silence isn't experienced as rest. It's experienced as an open invitation for the loop to fill it. This has a compounding effect on how enjoyable life feels overall, independent of how objectively good someone's circumstances actually are. It's entirely possible to have a stable job, caring relationships, and reasonable health, and still feel a persistent, low-grade dissatisfaction, simply because the mind rarely settles long enough to actually register and absorb the good that's already present. Overthinking doesn't just create anxiety about the future or regret about the past. It steals the present moment as a side effect, because the present moment requires a kind of attention that a looping mind struggles to sustain. People often describe this as feeling like life is passing by without being fully lived. And when they trace that feeling to its root, it frequently isn't a lack of good things happening. It's a mind too occupied reviewing and rehearsing to notice the good things that are already there. There's also a physical dimension to this loss of peace that's worth naming directly. Chronic activation of the stress response, even at low levels, sustained over long periods, has measurable effects on the body. Elevated cortisol, disrupted digestion, tension held in the shoulders, jaw, and neck, and a nervous system that struggles to downshift into genuine rest, even during moments explicitly meant for relaxation, like a weekend or a vacation. This is why some people can take time off work and still return feeling only marginally recovered. The environment changed, but the internal pattern of hypervigilant, looping thought didn't. And that pattern is what was driving the exhaustion in the first place, far more than the workload itself ever was. Chapter 5. The Death Spiral, where confidence and overthinking feed each other. By now, you can probably see how overthinking damages confidence and how it steals peace of mind. But there's a darker mechanism at work that makes this pattern so difficult to escape once it's established. Overthinking and low confidence don't just coexist, they actively feed each other, creating a self-reinforcing spiral that gets tighter and more difficult to break the longer it continues. Here's how the spiral works. Low confidence makes you doubt your ability to make a good decision. That doubt triggers overthinking, because if you don't trust your own judgment, the natural response is to keep analyzing in the hope that enough analysis will substitute for the confidence you're missing. But overthinking, as we've already established, doesn't actually produce more clarity. It produces exhaustion, hesitation, and often a decision made too late or not made at all. That outcome, whether it's a missed opportunity, an awkward delayed response, or a choice made out of desperation rather than conviction, gets logged by your subconscious as further evidence that your judgment can't be trusted, which lowers your confidence even further, which triggers even more overthinking the next time a decision arrives. Around and around it goes, each cycle a little tighter than the last. What makes this spiral so dangerous is that it's largely invisible from the inside. You don't experience it as a spiral. You experience it as a string of unrelated incidents. That one time you froze up in a conversation. That one project you kept delaying. That one relationship where you couldn't figure out how you felt until it was too late to matter. Each incident feels isolated, explainable by its own unique circumstances. It's only when you zoom out and look at the pattern across months or years that the spiral becomes visible, connecting all those isolated incidents into a single through line. A mind that doubts itself, overthinks as a result, and then uses the outcome of that overthinking as fresh evidence to justify the original doubt. This is also why generic confidence advice so often fails people trapped in this cycle. Telling someone to just believe in themselves more does nothing to interrupt the actual mechanism at work. You cannot think your way into confidence, while the very habit of excessive thinking is the thing destroying it. Trying to overthink your way out of overthinking is like trying to put out a fire by pouring on more of the exact fuel that's feeding it. It might feel like you're doing something productive, but you're only accelerating the same destructive process. The way out of a spiral is never found by analyzing the spiral harder. It's found by interrupting it at one of its points of contact and refusing to let the cycle complete itself the way it always has. That means catching the moment doubt tries to trigger a spiral of analysis, and instead of following it down familiar paths, choosing to act on incomplete information, tolerating the discomfort of not having certainty, and letting the outcome, whatever it is, become new evidence of a different kind. Evidence that you can decide, act, and survive the uncertainty of not knowing exactly how things will turn out in advance. This is precisely where we're headed in the chapters ahead. Not more analysis, but the specific, practical tools that let you break the spiral where it actually lives, in the moment of decision itself, rather than in the aftermath where the damage has already been logged. Understanding the spiral is not enough on its own, and it was never meant to be. It's the map. What comes next is how you actually walk a different path across it. And that is exactly where we're going from here. Before we move forward, it's worth naming one more feature of this spiral that makes it particularly resistant to casual attempts at change. It rewards you in the short term for staying inside it. Every time you choose to overthink instead of act, you get an immediate, if temporary, reduction in the discomfort of uncertainty. As long as you're still deliberating, you haven't yet risked being wrong. And that avoidance of risk feels like relief in the moment, even though it's setting up a much larger cost down the line. This is the same basic mechanism that makes procrastination so seductive. The relief is immediate and guaranteed. The cost is delayed and abstract, until suddenly it isn't, and you're facing the accumulated weight of 100 small avoidances all at once. This is precisely why willpower alone rarely breaks the spiral. You're not fighting a single bad decision. You're fighting a reinforcement pattern that has been rewarding the same behavior in small doses for years. Breaking it requires something more deliberate than simply resolving to try harder next time. It requires specific, repeatable interruptions, applied consistently enough that a new pattern has room to take root before the old one reasserts itself. That's not a discouraging fact. It's actually a liberating one, because it means you don't need to rely on willpower or motivation, which are unreliable by nature. You need a system, applied consistently, that makes the new pattern easier to choose than the old one, even on days when your motivation is low. Building exactly that system is what the rest of this journey is about. Chapter 6. The decision deadline that breaks the loop. If overthinking thrives on the absence of a boundary, the first and most direct tool to break it is to impose one deliberately. This is the practice of the decision deadline, and its power lies in how simple it is to understand and how uncomfortable it is to actually follow through on, which is exactly why so few people ever use it consistently, and exactly why it works so well for those who do. A decision deadline is precisely what it sounds like: a hard, non-negotiable point in time by which a decision must be made, regardless of whether you feel fully certain about it. This might sound almost too simple to matter, but its effectiveness comes from how directly it confronts the actual mechanism driving overthinking. Remember, overthinking survives because it offers the illusion of control through indefinite deliberation. A deadline removes that illusion by force. There is no more room for endless review, because the clock does not care how unfinished your analysis feels. Here's how to apply it in practice. When you notice a decision beginning to loop, whether it's what to say in a message, whether to take a new opportunity, or how to handle a difficult conversation, assign it an explicit deadline, not a vague someday, but a specific moment. By 6 o'clock tonight, before I go to sleep, within the next 10 minutes. The shorter and more specific the deadline, the more effective it tends to be, because vague deadlines simply become another home for the loop to continue operating inside of. The deeper reason this works is that it forces your brain to shift from analysis mode into commitment mode. And these are genuinely different cognitive states. Analysis mode keeps every option open, weighing possibilities without ever closing a door. Commitment mode requires closing doors, and closing doors is uncomfortable precisely because it means accepting the risk of being wrong. But here is what almost no one tells you about that discomfort. It is temporary, and it is far smaller than the discomfort of remaining suspended in uncertainty for days or weeks. The anxiety of committing to an imperfect decision peaks and then fades. The anxiety of endless deliberation doesn't peak. It simply continues, low and constant, draining you for as long as the decision remains unresolved. It helps to actually track this in your own experience the first several times you use a decision deadline, because most people, when they finally test it, are surprised by what they find. Rate your anxiety about a pending decision on a simple scale before the deadline. Then rate it again an hour after committing. Almost universally, the anxiety after committing, even to an imperfect or uncertain choice, is lower than the anxiety that was present during the deliberation itself. This isn't a coincidence. Uncertainty, held open indefinitely, is one of the most reliably uncomfortable states the human mind can occupy. More uncomfortable, in many documented cases, than knowing a negative outcome for certain. Committing, even to a decision that might not work out, resolves that specific discomfort immediately, replacing an open-ended, anxious state with a concrete situation you can now actually respond to. There's an important nuance here worth addressing directly, because it's the objection almost everyone raises the first time they hear about decision deadlines. What if the decision truly is complex and deserves more time? The answer is that a decision deadline does not mean rushing every choice you'll ever make. It means being honest about how much additional time would actually improve the quality of the decision versus how much additional time is simply feeding an anxious loop that has already extracted all the useful information it's going to extract. Most people, if they're honest with themselves, know within the first several minutes of considering a decision roughly what their answer will be. The hours and days that follow are rarely producing new insight. They're producing repetition, dressed up as diligence. There's a simple test you can apply here to distinguish genuine remaining uncertainty from repetitive noise. Ask yourself whether continuing to think about this decision right now would introduce any new information you don't currently have access to. If the answer is yes, if there's a specific piece of missing information you could realistically obtain, a conversation you haven't had yet, data you haven't looked up, then it's reasonable to extend your deadline specifically to obtain that information and then decide once you have it. But if the honest answer is no, if you already have everything you're going to have, and further thinking would simply be replaying the same considerations you've already fully weighed, then you already have your answer sitting right in front of you. The discomfort of committing to it is not a sign that you need more time. It's simply the discomfort of choosing, which no amount of additional deliberation was ever going to remove. To make deadlines effective, pair them with a second rule. Once the deadline passes and a decision is made, you do not reopen it that same day. This might feel harsh at first, but it's essential, because without this rule, the mind will simply treat the deadline as a pause button rather than an ending, and the loop will quietly resume an hour later under the guise of just double-checking. A decision, once made within its deadline, needs to be allowed to stand, at least long enough for you to act on it, and gather real information from the outcome rather than more imagined information from continued speculation. Start small. Apply decision deadlines first to low-stakes choices: what to eat, what to wear, which task to tackle first, so that you build comfort with the practice before applying it to higher-stakes situations. As you gather evidence that fast decisions rarely produce the catastrophic outcomes your anxious mind predicts, the practice becomes easier to extend into more significant areas of your life. This is not about being reckless. It's about recognizing that the vast majority of decisions you agonize over are far more reversible and far less consequential than the anxious loop inside your head insists they are. There's a useful mental framework that makes this easier to apply consistently, sometimes described as the distinction between one-way doors and two-way doors. A two-way door decision is one you can reverse or adjust relatively easily if it turns out to be wrong. Trying a new approach at work, reaching out to someone, saying yes to an invitation you're unsure about. A one-way door decision is far harder to reverse and genuinely warrants more careful consideration. Major financial commitments, decisions that significantly affect other people, choices that are difficult or costly to undo. The mistake overthinkers consistently make is treating almost every decision as if it were a one-way door, applying the same exhausting level of deliberation to what to say in a text message as they would to a major life decision. Learning to quickly sort a decision into one of these two categories, which itself should take seconds, not hours, immediately tells you how much deliberation is actually warranted. Most of what consumes your mental energy every day is sitting behind a two-way door, fully reversible, and treating it that way frees up an enormous amount of capacity that's currently being spent on decisions that were never as high stakes as they felt. It also helps to notice what a decision deadline actually protects you from. Beyond just the exhaustion of deliberation, it protects you from a particular kind of self-inflicted damage. The erosion of trust in your own judgment that happens every time you watch yourself fail to commit. Each time you honor a deadline and follow through, regardless of outcome, you interrupt that erosion and begin actively reversing it. This is why the practice matters far beyond the specific decisions it's applied to in the moment. It's not just about making better choices faster. It's about rebuilding the relationship you have with your own mind, one bounded decision at a time, until trusting yourself to decide within a reasonable window starts to feel normal again instead of terrifying. Chapter 7. Training yourself to trust your own judgment again. Confidence, as we established earlier, is not a trait you either have or lack. It is a pattern built through repeated evidence that your judgment can be trusted. This means the path back to confidence is not found through motivation, affirmations, or simply deciding to feel more sure of yourself. It's found through a deliberate practice of accumulating small, undeniable proof that you are capable of trusting your own mind, one decision at a time. The starting point is what we might call the evidence log, though you don't need to formalize it into anything complicated. It's simply the practice of noticing, consciously, every time you make a decision and follow through on it, especially the small ones that would normally pass by unnoticed, choosing quickly what to order and eating it without a second thought about whether you should have chosen differently, sending the message you drafted the first time without rewriting it 4 more times first, making a plan and sticking to it even when a small doubt shows up halfway through. Each of these moments, however minor they seem, is a deposit into the exact account that overthinking has been withdrawing from for years. The mind doesn't distinguish between big and small triumphs of self-trust nearly as sharply as we assume. It notices the pattern of trust itself, repeated consistently, regardless of the size of the decision involved. An important part of this practice is learning to separate the outcome of a decision from the value of having made it decisively. This distinction matters enormously, because one of the reasons overthinking persists is the belief that a decision is only validated if it turns out well. But that standard sets you up to distrust yourself even when you're doing everything right. Because plenty of well-made decisions produce imperfect outcomes simply due to factors outside your control. The goal is not to only trust decisions that turn out perfectly. The goal is to trust the process of deciding itself, regardless of outcome. Because a good decision-making process, repeated consistently, produces good results far more reliably over time than an anxious, over-analyzed one ever will, even though any single instance might not go exactly as hoped. This distinction between process and outcome is one that people who make high-stakes decisions professionally, in fields like investing, medicine, or competitive strategy, tend to understand intuitively, even if they've never articulated it explicitly. They know that a decision made with sound reasoning and the best available information at the time can still produce a poor result, purely due to factors that were genuinely unknowable in advance. They also know that a poorly reasoned decision can occasionally produce a good result through sheer luck. If you judge your decision-making purely by outcomes, you end up reinforcing exactly the wrong lessons, crediting lucky impulsiveness, while punishing yourself for well-reasoned decisions that simply didn't pan out. Judging by process instead. Did I gather reasonable information? Did I commit within a reasonable time frame? Did I act in a way consistent with my values and goals? Gives you a far more accurate and far more stable foundation for building genuine self-trust. One that isn't at the mercy of factors you never controlled in the first place. There's a specific practice that accelerates this rebuilding process significantly. Acting before you feel ready. This sounds counterintuitive, almost reckless, but it directly targets the false belief that confidence must arrive before action, when in reality the relationship runs the opposite direction far more often than people realize. Confidence is frequently the result of having acted despite uncertainty and survived it, not the prerequisite for acting in the first place. Waiting to feel confident before making a decision is like waiting to feel physically strong before ever lifting a weight. The feeling you're waiting for is actually produced by the repetition you're avoiding. This particular reversal, action producing confidence rather than the other way around, is worth dwelling on because it contradicts what most people have quietly believed their entire lives without ever examining it directly. If you wait for certainty before acting, You are, by definition, waiting for something that overthinking itself is actively preventing you from ever reaching. Since more analysis rarely produces more certainty, it typically just produces more analysis. This means that for someone caught in the overthinking pattern, waiting to feel ready isn't a reasonable, cautious strategy. It's an indefinite postponement disguised as prudence, because the feeling being waited for was never going to arrive through the very process being used to chase it. This is also where identity plays a critical role in accelerating or blocking the process. If you continue to privately describe yourself as someone who overthinks everything, someone who can never make up their mind, someone who always second-guesses themselves, you are giving your subconscious a script to keep performing, regardless of the individual decisions you make. Language shapes identity, and identity shapes behavior far more powerfully than most people give it credit for. Begin deliberately using different language, even if it feels untrue at first. I am someone who trusts my judgment. I decide and I adjust as needed. I don't need certainty to move forward. These statements are not magic, and saying them alone will not undo years of pattern, but paired with actual, repeated, decisive action, they help align your internal narrative with the evidence you're building, rather than working against it. Finally, understand that setbacks along this path are not evidence that the process isn't working. They're an expected and necessary part of it. You will make a fast decision at some point, and it will turn out poorly. When this happens, the old pattern will try to convince you that this proves overthinking was right all along, that you should have deliberated longer. Resist this conclusion. One imperfect outcome does not invalidate an entire process built on hundreds of decisions. The measure of success here was never a perfect track record. It was a fundamentally healthier relationship with your own judgment, one where a single wrong decision doesn't send you spiraling back into years of hesitation, but simply becomes information you use to decide a little better next time, and then you move forward again. There's one more dimension of this rebuilding process worth naming clearly, because it often gets overlooked: the role of self-compassion in making the entire practice sustainable. Many people, once they understand intellectually that overthinking has been damaging their confidence, respond by becoming harshly critical of themselves every time they notice the pattern resurface. This backfires because self-criticism activates the same threat detection system we discussed earlier, which makes the nervous system more reactive, not less, and paradoxically makes the overthinking pattern more likely to intensify rather than fade. The more useful response, every time you catch yourself spiraling, is closer to what you might offer a friend in the same situation: an acknowledgement, without judgment, that the pattern showed up again, followed by a gentle redirection back toward action. I notice I'm doing the thing again. That's okay. What's the next small step? This tone matters far more than it might seem, because a nervous system that feels safe, even while making mistakes, regulates far more easily than one bracing against its own harsh internal criticism. It's also worth acknowledging honestly that this rebuilding process is not linear. There will be weeks where decisiveness feels natural and weeks where old patterns resurface with surprising intensity, often triggered by stress, fatigue, or situations that carry particular emotional weight for you personally. This is not a sign of failure or of the process not working. Confidence, like any skill built through repetition, strengthens on average over time even while it fluctuates day to day. The people who successfully rebuild trust in their own judgment are not the ones who never regress. They're the ones who don't treat a regression as proof that the entire effort was pointless, and who simply return to the practice the next time a decision presents itself, regardless of how the last one went. Chapter 8. Calming the body so the mind can follow. Because overthinking is not purely a mental event but a physiological one, involving your amygdala, your stress hormones, and your entire nervous system. One of the most effective tools available to you doesn't start in your thoughts at all. It starts in your body. Learning to regulate your physical state directly is often faster and more reliable than trying to reason your way out of a spiral, because it addresses the root activation rather than trying to negotiate with the thoughts that activation is producing. The most immediately accessible tool here is your breath, specifically slow, extended exhalation. When you breathe in a slow, controlled rhythm, with an exhale that lasts longer than your inhale, you directly stimulate the vagus nerve, which plays a central role in shifting your nervous system out of the heightened, threat-alert state that fuels overthinking and into a calmer, more regulated state where clear decision-making becomes possible again. A simple version of this. Inhale for a count of 4. Hold briefly. Exhale for a count of 6 to 8. Repeated for even 1 or 2 minutes. This measurably shifts your physiological state, and as your body calms, the intensity and urgency of the looping thoughts riding on top of that activation tends to calm along with it. Physical movement serves a similar function through a different channel. Anxiety and overthinking generate a buildup of stress hormones that your body, evolutionarily, expected to be discharged through physical action. Running, fighting, physically resolving the threat. In modern life, the threat is usually a decision or a social situation, not something you can physically run from, which means those stress hormones often have nowhere to go and simply recirculate, feeding the mental loop further. Deliberately introducing movement, a brisk walk, a few minutes of stretching, even shaking out your hands and shoulders, gives your body a way to metabolize that stress response, which frequently produces a noticeable settling of the mental spiral within minutes, in a way that sitting still and thinking harder never manages to achieve. Cold exposure is another underused but remarkably effective tool for interrupting an intense spiral in the moment. Splashing cold water on your face, or briefly holding something cold, triggers what's known as the mammalian dive reflex, which rapidly slows your heart rate and shifts your nervous system state. This isn't a long-term solution to chronic overthinking, but as an in-the-moment circuit breaker. When a spiral has become so intense that it's difficult to access any of the more cognitive tools, it can create just enough space to think clearly again. Posture and physical positioning offer another accessible, often overlooked lever. Research into the connection between body position and emotional state has consistently found that posture doesn't just reflect internal state. It actively influences it. Sitting hunched forward, arms crossed, shoulders curled in, a position many people unconsciously adopt while spiraling through anxious thought, tends to reinforce feelings of smallness and threat. Deliberately shifting into a more open, upright posture, shoulders back, chest open, feet planted, sends a different signal to your nervous system, one more associated with safety and capability than with threat and contraction. This might sound almost too simple to matter, but the body and mind operate as a genuinely two-way system. each influencing the other continuously, and small physical adjustments are one of the most immediately accessible entry points into that system, available to you in literally any moment, regardless of where you are or what resources you have on hand. It's worth understanding why these physical interventions matter as much as they do, rather than treating them as a minor supplement to the real work. As we covered earlier, your prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational thought, loses some of its regulatory power over an activated amygdala once stress hormones cross a certain threshold. This means that in the middle of an intense spiral, your capacity for rational self-talk is genuinely, biologically reduced, not because you're weak-willed, but because the system responsible for calm reasoning is temporarily operating with less authority. Trying to think your way out at that exact moment is fighting an uphill battle against your own biology. Calming the body first restores the conditions under which your rational mind can actually function effectively again, which is why physical regulation should be treated not as an alternative to mental tools, but as the necessary first step that makes the mental tools usable in the first place. Build these practices into your day proactively, rather than only reaching for them once a spiral is already in full force. A daily practice of even 5 minutes of slow breathing or movement lowers your baseline stress reactivity over time, meaning it takes a larger trigger to activate a spiral in the first place. And when one does begin, it tends to be less intense and easier to interrupt, because you're not starting from an already elevated baseline every single day. Sleep and diet, while less immediately dramatic than a breathing exercise or a cold splash of water, play a significant supporting role that's worth addressing directly, because they influence the same nervous system regulation everything else in this chapter depends on. Chronic sleep deprivation reduces the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate the amygdala, essentially operating in the exact same direction as stress hormones, weakening your capacity for calm, rational thought precisely when you need it most. This creates a compounding cycle for many overthinkers. Poor sleep, often disrupted by the very overthinking discussed earlier, further impairs the brain's ability to regulate the next day's stress response, which increases the likelihood of overthinking the following night, and so on. Prioritizing consistent, adequate sleep isn't a peripheral wellness tip in this context. It's a direct intervention on the biological mechanism driving the entire pattern. Caffeine and blood sugar swings deserve a brief mention here too, because both directly influence the same physiological stress response we've been discussing. High caffeine intake, particularly later in the day, can mimic and amplify the exact physical sensations: elevated heart rate, restlessness, a general sense of alertness bordering on unease, that make an anxious spiral easier to trigger and harder to distinguish from genuine danger. Similarly, large swings in blood sugar from delayed meals or highly processed food can produce physical symptoms: shakiness, irritability, a racing mind, that get misattributed entirely to psychological causes when the root trigger was partly physiological all along. None of this means these factors are the sole cause of chronic overthinking, but addressing them removes unnecessary physiological noise that otherwise makes the psychological work significantly harder than it needs to be. Chapter 9. Becoming someone who decides. Every tool covered so far works best when it's anchored to something deeper than a technique. A genuine shift in identity, from someone who overthinks to someone who decides. This distinction matters because techniques alone, practiced inconsistently, tend to fade the moment life gets stressful or busy. Identity, once it shifts, tends to sustain behavior automatically because you're no longer forcing yourself to act against your self-concept. You're simply acting in alignment with who you now understand yourself to be. Identity shift doesn't happen through a single decision to think differently about yourself. It happens through repeated action that gradually accumulates into undeniable proof, until the new identity feels less like something you're claiming and more like something you've actually become. This is why the earlier chapters on decision deadlines and evidence building are not separate from this chapter. They are the raw material this chapter depends on. You cannot talk yourself into becoming a decisive person. You can only act your way into it, one instance at a time, until decisiveness stops feeling like an exception and starts feeling like your default. A useful practice here is to explicitly ask yourself, in moments of hesitation, what would the version of me who trusts their judgment do right now? This question works because it bypasses the anxious, deliberating part of your mind and instead accesses a kind of aspirational clarity. The clarity you already have about what decisive action looks like, even if you don't yet consistently embody it. Over time, as you answer this question with action rather than just contemplation, the gap between the aspirational version and your actual behavior narrows, until eventually there's no meaningful gap left at all. This technique works particularly well because of how the human mind processes identity-based questions differently from purely rational ones. When you ask yourself, "What should I do in this situation?" you invite the full weight of every fear, every possible consequence, every worst-case scenario your anxious mind can generate. But when you ask, "What would a decisive version of me do?" you're accessing a different kind of knowledge entirely, a kind of embodied, almost instinctive understanding of decisive action that most people already possess, even if they rarely access it, because they've spent so many years defaulting to the anxious question instead. You already know, on some level, what a confident, decisive response to most situations in your life would look like. The work is not acquiring that knowledge. It's building the habit of consulting it instead of the anxious alternative you've relied on for so long. It's important to address a misconception that often creeps in here. Becoming someone who decides does not mean becoming someone who never doubts, never second guesses, or never feels the pull of an old pattern. Doubt doesn't disappear simply because you've built a stronger identity around decisiveness. What changes is your relationship to the doubt. A decisive person still feels uncertainty. They've simply learned not to treat that uncertainty as a stop sign. They've learned to act alongside it rather than waiting for it to fully resolve before moving. This is an important distinction because many people abandon the identity shift prematurely, assuming that because they still feel afraid or unsure, the work isn't working. In reality, the work was never about eliminating fear or uncertainty. It was about no longer letting fear and uncertainty be the deciding vote every single time. Language plays a supporting but meaningful role in reinforcing this identity. Pay attention to how you narrate your own decisions, out loud or internally. Someone still operating from the old identity might say, "I don't know. I'm terrible at making decisions. I always overthink everything." Someone operating from the new identity says something closer to, "I made a call, and I'll adjust if I need to." This isn't about denial or forced positivity. It's about accurately describing a process that has genuinely changed. Rather than continuing to describe yourself, using an outdated script that no longer reflects the work you're doing. It also helps to surround this identity shift with environmental reinforcement. Notice and consciously acknowledge every instance, however small, where you acted decisively instead of spiraling. This isn't about empty self-congratulation. It's about giving your brain a clear, repeated signal that this new behavior is being noticed and valued, which strengthens the neural pathway associated with it, the same way any skill strengthens through recognized, repeated practice. The goal is for decisiveness to eventually require no more conscious effort than the overthinking pattern once did, because at that point, it will have become just as automatic, just as effortless, and infinitely more useful to the life you're building. The people around you can also play a meaningful role in this shift, whether they realize it or not. Pay attention to whether the people you spend the most time with tend to reinforce careful, decisive action, or whether they tend to model and even encourage the same anxious deliberation you're trying to move away from. This isn't about blaming your environment for a pattern that's ultimately internal, but environments do shape behavior, often more powerfully than willpower alone. If someone close to you responds to every uncertainty by spiraling through worst-case scenarios out loud, spending significant time around that pattern can quietly pull you back into it, simply through proximity and social mirroring. Where possible, seek out and spend time with people who model the kind of decisive, grounded confidence you're building toward. You'll likely find that this kind of energy is at least as contagious as anxiety is, and being around it consistently makes the identity shift considerably easier to sustain. It's also worth addressing what happens when this new identity gets tested by a genuinely high-stakes situation, because low-stakes practice alone can create a false sense of mastery that wavers the first time something significant is actually on the line. When that moment arrives, and it will, the goal is not to feel calm and certain. That expectation itself often makes things harder. The goal is to apply the same principles you've been practicing at smaller scale. Give yourself a reasonable, bounded amount of time to gather the information that would genuinely improve the decision. Use physical regulation to keep your nervous system out of full threat mode. And then commit, fully aware that commitment does not require the absence of fear. The version of you built through consistent small practice is more than capable of handling a large moment. The scale of the decision changes. The underlying skill you've been building does not. Chapter 10. Turning reflection into action instead of rumination. None of this means you should never think deeply about a decision, and it's important to be clear about that distinction before moving forward, because otherwise it's easy to swing from one extreme, chronic overthinking, into another, impulsive decisions made without any real reflection at all. The goal was never to eliminate thinking. It was to eliminate the specific, repetitive, action-avoidant version of thinking that we've been calling overthinking throughout this video. There is a healthier alternative, and learning to recognize the difference is what allows you to keep the benefits of genuine reflection while cutting out the part that's been draining you. The clearest distinguishing feature between productive reflection and unproductive rumination is direction. Productive reflection moves toward a decision or an action. It has a natural endpoint, because its purpose is to gather just enough clarity to move forward. Rumination, by contrast, circles the same territory repeatedly without ever producing a next step. If you notice that you've considered the same angle of a problem more than 2 or 3 times without any new information entering the picture, That's a reliable signal you've crossed from reflection into rumination, and continuing further will not produce the clarity you're hoping for. It will only produce more fatigue. A practical way to harness this distinction is a technique sometimes called worry scheduling, or in this context, we might call it reflection scheduling. Rather than allowing a concern to intrude on your attention at random throughout the day, whenever it happens to surface, you designate a specific window, 10 or 15 minutes, during which you deliberately think through the issue as thoroughly as you want. Outside of that window, when the thought tries to resurface, you consciously note it and tell yourself, "I'll think about this during my scheduled time," rather than engaging with it immediately. This might sound like it would be difficult to enforce, but in practice, most people find that simply knowing there is a designated time for the thought reduces its urgency significantly, and by the time the scheduled window arrives, much of the emotional charge has already faded on its own. Writing is another powerful way to convert unstructured rumination into structured reflection. The simple act of putting a looping thought into written words forces it out of the vague, repetitive, emotionally charged form it takes inside your head and into a more concrete, examinable form on paper. Write down exactly what you're worried about, what you actually know for certain, what you don't know, and what the very next possible action could be, however small. This process alone often reveals something important. A thought that felt enormous and unresolvable while spinning silently in your mind frequently looks far smaller and more manageable once it's laid out plainly in front of you. The vagueness was part of what made it feel so overwhelming. Specificity deflates it. There's a further layer to this practice that many people miss the first time they try it. Separating what is actually within your control from what isn't. When you write out a concern, draw a simple line down the middle of the page, or just mentally sort the details into two categories. On one side, place everything about the situation that you can directly influence through your own choices and actions. On the other side, place everything that depends on other people, chance, timing, or circumstances, entirely outside your control. Most rumination spends the overwhelming majority of its energy on the second category, replaying what someone else might think, what might happen, how things might unfold, none of which you can actually act on directly. Once you can see clearly how much of your mental energy has been spent on the uncontrollable side of that line, it becomes much easier to consciously redirect your attention toward the smaller but entirely actionable list on the other side, which is the only place genuine progress was ever going to come from in the first place. It's worth explicitly naming one more common trap here, because it catches even people who have made real progress with everything covered in this video. Mistaking worry for love or responsibility. Many people who overthink, particularly when it comes to relationships or the well-being of people they care about, believe on some level that continuing to worry is a form of care, that stopping the mental replay would mean not caring enough. This belief deserves to be examined honestly, because it rarely holds up under scrutiny. Worry that produces no action changes nothing about the outcome for the person you're worried about. It only changes your own state, usually for the worse. Genuine care shows up through action, through a message sent, a boundary held, a conversation had, a decision made on someone's behalf when appropriate. The replaying itself was never the caring part. It only ever felt that way because it was familiar. And familiarity is easy to mistake for meaning. By now, across everything covered in this video, a consistent thread should be visible. Overthinking was never protecting you. It was quietly costing you your confidence and your peace of mind, both of which can be rebuilt not through more thought, but through smaller, more deliberate, more decisive engagement with your own life. The tools in this section: decision deadlines, evidence building, physical regulation, identity reinforcement, and structured reflection, are not meant to be used once and forgotten. They are meant to become the new default operating system running underneath your daily decisions, gradually replacing the old one that's been running the show for far too long. One deliberate choice at a time. What remains is the deeper work of sustaining this shift, once the initial motivation of hearing these ideas for the first time inevitably fades. Because it will, the same way motivation fades after any new insight, no matter how compelling it feels in this moment. That's exactly where we're headed next. Not more tools to add to the list, but the underlying structure that keeps all of these tools active in your life long after today, through the moments when old habits feel easiest to fall back into, and through the specific situations, relationships, work, the quiet hours of the night, where overthinking has historically had the strongest grip on you. Finally, build in a closing question to every episode of reflection, whether scheduled or spontaneous. What is the smallest next action available to me right now? This question is what keeps reflection tethered to its actual purpose. If there is a concrete next action, take it, even if it's small, even if it doesn't fully resolve the larger situation. If there genuinely isn't one available yet, because you're waiting on information or a specific circumstance to change, then consciously set the thought down until that circumstance changes, rather than continuing to turn it over in the meantime. This single habit, closing every reflective session with a concrete next step or a conscious release, is what separates thinking that serves you from thinking that quietly consumes you, and building it into your daily life is one of the most sustainable ways to make sure the progress you've built through everything in this video continues long after you've finished listening. Chapter 11. Overthinking in Relationships and the Fear of Being Misunderstood. Nowhere does overthinking cause more quiet damage than in the space between people. Relationships, whether romantic, family, or friendship, are built on a foundation of trust and presence, and both of those are precisely what chronic overthinking erodes without announcing itself. It doesn't show up as a dramatic betrayal or an obvious conflict. It shows up as a text message rewritten 8 times before sending, a comment replayed for hours searching for a hidden insult that was never actually there, a silence interpreted as anger when it was simply someone else having an ordinary tired evening. The core mechanism at play in relational overthinking is a specific kind of mind reading, where you attempt to determine what someone else is thinking or feeling based on incomplete information, and because the information is incomplete, your anxious mind fills the gaps with whatever narrative feels most threatening. If a friend takes longer than usual to respond to a message, the overthinking mind doesn't default to "they're probably just busy." It reaches for "they're upset with me. I said something wrong. They're pulling away." This isn't because you're irrational. It's because an uncertain social signal registers to your threat detection system as a potential rejection. And rejection was historically one of the most dangerous outcomes a social creature could face, since being cast out of the group once meant a genuine threat to survival. Your brain still treats it with that same disproportionate urgency. even though the actual stakes of a delayed reply are almost never what your nervous system is treating them as. This pattern creates a particular kind of exhausting labor inside relationships that the other person is often completely unaware is even happening, while they're simply living their life, responding to messages when they have time. Having an off day that has nothing to do with you, you might be constructing elaborate theories about what their behavior means, rehearsing conversations you'll probably never have, and quietly building resentment or anxiety over a story that exists entirely inside your own head. The tragedy here is twofold. First, the emotional toll is real, even though the triggering event may have been entirely imagined. Second, this pattern, left unaddressed, often produces exactly the disconnection it fears, not because the other person pulled away first, but because the overthinking itself creates distance through withdrawal, through unspoken resentment, through a kind of guardedness that the other person eventually senses even without understanding its source. The antidote here is not simply telling yourself to stop worrying, which rarely works for reasons we've already covered. It's building the specific habit of checking your interpretation against reality rather than treating your anxious narrative as established fact. This means, in practice, actually asking the person involved, directly and without excessive hedging, rather than spending hours constructing theories you never verify. "Hey, I noticed you seemed quiet earlier. Is everything okay between us?" This single sentence, uncomfortable as it might feel to say, resolves in 30 seconds what unchecked overthinking could otherwise stretch across days of private anguish. The discomfort of asking is real, but it is a single, contained discomfort, compared against the much larger, ongoing discomfort of sustained uncertainty that overthinking would otherwise generate. There's also a deeper layer worth naming here: the fear of being misunderstood itself, which often sits underneath relational overthinking as its actual root cause. Many people who overthink their communications aren't primarily worried about the practical consequences of a miscommunication. They're worried about what a misunderstanding would mean about them. That being misread as harsh means they actually are harsh. That being misread as uncaring means they actually don't care. This fear treats other people's momentary, imperfect perceptions as definitive verdicts on your character, when in reality, everyone occasionally comes across differently than they intend, and healthy relationships have enough resilience and goodwill built into them to absorb the ordinary friction of imperfect communication without it threatening the relationship's foundation. Trusting that resilience, rather than trying to preemptively engineer every message into a flawless, unmisreadable version of itself, is often the single biggest relief available to someone who has spent years exhausting themselves in this particular way. There's one more relational pattern worth naming directly, because it tends to surprise people the first time they recognize it in themselves. The tendency to overthink on someone else's behalf, convinced that doing so is an act of care rather than a private, unproductive habit. Replaying a friend's difficult situation for hours, imagining every possible way it could unfold, rehearsing advice you'll probably never actually give, feels like loyalty while you're doing it. But notice, honestly, whether any of that replaying changes the actual support you offer. In most cases, a present, attentive conversation, offered once, provides more genuine value than hours of private rumination ever could. The instinct to worry on someone's behalf is worth redirecting toward the same principle covered throughout this video. Convert it into a single, concrete action. A message sent, a question asked, a moment of full presence, rather than letting it become another unresolved loop running quietly in the background of your own mind. It's worth touching on how this pattern shows up specifically in the early stages of romantic relationships, since this is often where relational overthinking reaches its most intense form, the uncertainty inherent to a new connection, not yet knowing where things stand, not yet having the established trust that comes with time, creates an environment where the mind has maximum room to generate anxious interpretations from minimal information. Every response time, every word choice, every small inconsistency becomes raw material for analysis. This is, in a strange way, one of the most understandable places for the pattern to intensify, since the underlying uncertainty is often genuinely real, not purely imagined. But the same principle still applies. Analysis cannot substitute for the information that can only come from continued honest interaction over time. The clarity you're searching for through replaying every interaction will only ever actually arrive through more direct communication and more lived experience with the person, never through additional hours of private theorizing about signals that were never designed to carry the weight of certainty in the first place. There's also real value in recognizing when a relational concern is worth raising directly versus when it genuinely is something you can simply let settle on its own without turning it into either an internal spiral or an external conversation. Not every fleeting worry about a relationship needs to be voiced immediately, and part of relational maturity is developing a reasonable filter for which concerns are significant enough to warrant a direct conversation and which are simply passing anxieties that will resolve on their own with a little time and a little trust extended toward the other person and toward the relationship itself. The goal was never to convert every anxious thought into an urgent conversation. It was to stop the specific pattern of private, unresolved theorizing that neither gets voiced nor gets released, and instead sits there for days, quietly draining your peace of mind while accomplishing absolutely nothing for the relationship it claims to be protecting. This same discernment applies to family relationships, which carry their own particular weight because of how long-standing and layered they tend to be. Old family dynamics often give the overthinking mind an especially rich supply of material, past conflicts, long-held roles, unspoken expectations, all of which can make a single, ordinary interaction, a comment at a family dinner, a delayed response to a call, feel loaded with history far beyond what the moment itself actually warrants. Here, too, the underlying practice remains the same. Notice when you're constructing an elaborate interpretation from limited information, and choose between direct, honest communication or a conscious release of the thought, rather than letting it accumulate silently in the space between you and people who have known you the longest, and who, in many cases, deserve the same benefit of the doubt you would readily extend to someone you just met. Chapter 12. Overthinking at Work and the Trap of Perceived Competence. The professional world presents its own distinct version of the overthinking trap, one closely tied to how competence and value are perceived, both by others and, more importantly, by yourself. In a work environment, overthinking often masquerades as diligence, as being detail-oriented, as caring deeply about doing a good job. This makes it especially difficult to recognize as a problem, because the very behaviors that are quietly draining you are the same ones that might be earning you praise for thoroughness, at least until the cost becomes visible in missed deadlines, stalled projects, or a growing reputation for being someone who takes unusually long to reach decisions that colleagues resolve in a fraction of the time. One of the most common arenas for this pattern is written communication. Emails rewritten repeatedly, messages to a manager or colleague drafted and redrafted, searching for a version that couldn't possibly be misread or judged unfavorably. This consumes enormous amounts of time and mental energy for a return that is almost always negligible, because the difference between a good enough version of a professional message and an exhaustively polished one is rarely perceptible to the recipient, who is reading quickly and moving on with their own day, not analyzing your word choices with the same intensity you applied while writing them. Recognizing this asymmetry, that you are investing analytical effort at a level the recipient will never match with their attention, is often enough on its own to loosen the grip of this particular version of the pattern. A more consequential version shows up around decisions themselves. Whether to take on a new project, whether to raise a concern in a meeting, whether to pursue a promotion or a new role. Here, the stakes genuinely are higher, which makes the overthinking feel more justified, but the underlying mechanism operates identically to everything covered earlier in this video. The mind treats the discomfort of an imperfect decision as more dangerous than the accumulating cost of prolonged indecision, even though, in a professional context, indecision itself often carries the greater cost. Opportunities in a career are frequently time-sensitive. A role gets filled by someone else. A project gets assigned to a colleague who spoke up first. The market or the team's needs shift while you are still weighing pros and cons. Overthinking doesn't just risk making a worse decision than you might have made quickly. It risks having no decision left to make at all, because the window closed while you were still deliberating inside it. There's also a specific psychological trap worth naming directly in a professional context. The belief that visible hesitation signals humility or care, while visible decisiveness signals recklessness. In reality, most workplaces reward the opposite pattern far more consistently than people expect. Colleagues and leadership generally place more trust in someone who makes a reasonable decision promptly and adjusts as needed, than in someone who takes an unusually long time to arrive at a similar conclusion. Decisiveness, applied with sound judgment, reads as competence and confidence. Chronic hesitation, even when well-intentioned, often reads, whether fairly or not, as a lack of confidence in one's own expertise, which can quietly undermine the professional reputation the overthinking was originally meant to protect. Building a healthier relationship with decision-making at work benefits enormously from applying the same decision deadline principle covered earlier, but with a professional-specific addition. Communicate your timeline to others when relevant. Rather than silently deliberating and hoping no one notices how long it's taking, say explicitly, "I'll have a decision on this by end of day tomorrow." This does two things simultaneously. It creates external accountability that makes the deadline harder to quietly extend, and it reframes your process, in the eyes of colleagues, as structured and intentional, rather than uncertain and stalled, even while you're doing the same internal work of interrupting the overthinking loop that we've discussed throughout this video. It's also worth addressing the specific fear of asking questions or admitting uncertainty at work, because this often quietly fuels overthinking in professional settings more than people realize. Many people spend hours privately trying to work out an answer they could have obtained in minutes by simply asking a colleague or manager, purely because asking feels like an admission of inadequacy. In reality, the opposite is usually true. People who ask clear, well-considered questions efficiently are generally seen as more capable, not less, because it signals an accurate understanding of what they do and don't yet know, along with the confidence to move the situation forward rather than silently struggling with it. Reframing questions as a tool for efficient decisiveness rather than as evidence of weakness removes one of the more common hidden drivers keeping the overthinking loop alive in professional environments, specifically career-level decisions, whether to leave a job, whether to pursue a significant change in direction, deserve a brief, separate mention because they carry a scale of consequence that makes some additional deliberation genuinely reasonable, unlike the smaller daily decisions covered elsewhere in this video. Even here, though, the same underlying principle holds. There is a meaningful difference between deliberation that's actively gathering new, relevant information, speaking with people in the field you're considering, understanding the realistic financial implications, and deliberation that's simply replaying the same handful of fears in a loop without producing anything new. Give yourself permission to take the time a genuinely significant decision deserves, but apply the same honest test covered earlier. Is more time actually producing new clarity? Or has the useful information already been gathered, leaving only the discomfort of choosing itself still to be faced? Even major life decisions benefit from an eventual deadline, not because they should be rushed, but because an open-ended timeline for a decision this significant tends to produce the most intense and prolonged version of the overthinking spiral this entire video has been addressing. There's a final professional consideration worth naming, because it affects nearly everyone at some point: how to handle feedback or criticism without it triggering a fresh spiral of overthinking. A single piece of critical feedback, even when delivered constructively, and even when it's genuinely minor in the broader scope of your work, can become the seed of hours or days of rumination for someone prone to this pattern, replayed obsessively, expanded into a broader narrative about incompetence that the original feedback never actually implied. The practice worth building here is a simple, deliberate separation between receiving information and evaluating your worth. Feedback is data about a specific piece of work or a specific behavior offered at a specific moment in time. It is not a verdict on your overall competence or your value as a professional, no matter how much the anxious mind wants to expand it into exactly that. Receiving feedback well means extracting the useful, actionable part, applying it where relevant, and consciously declining to let it metastasize into the kind of identity-level rumination that perfectionism, covered in the next chapter, so often thrives on. Chapter 13. Perfectionism, the hidden engine behind the loop. Underneath a great deal of chronic overthinking sits a driver that rarely gets named directly, even though it's often the real engine powering the entire pattern. Perfectionism. Not the popular, somewhat glamorized version of perfectionism, the idea of simply having high standards, but the deeper, more corrosive version where your sense of worth becomes quietly tied to producing a flawless outcome. And any decision that carries even a small risk of being wrong starts to feel like a referendum on your value as a person, not just a practical choice with practical consequences. This connection matters because it explains why simple, logical arguments about the cost of overthinking, no matter how compelling, often fail to produce lasting change on their own. you can fully understand, intellectually, that a decision deadline would serve you well and still find yourself unable to follow it. Because the resistance isn't coming from a lack of logic. It's coming from a deeper belief that getting this wrong would mean something unbearable about who you are. As long as that belief remains unexamined, techniques alone will only ever produce partial, inconsistent results, because you're trying to override a deep identity-level fear using surface-level tools. Perfectionism of this kind is frequently rooted in early experiences where love, approval, or safety felt conditional on performance, where mistakes were met with disproportionate criticism, or where achievement became one of the few reliable ways to receive attention or validation. This doesn't mean everyone who overthinks had a difficult childhood in some dramatic sense. It simply means that somewhere along the way, a connection was formed between being wrong and being unworthy. A connection strong enough that the nervous system now treats an ordinary imperfect decision with the same intensity it might treat a genuine threat to belonging or safety. Understanding this origin isn't about assigning blame to anyone. It's about recognizing that the intensity of your reaction to small, reversible decisions makes far more sense once you see it as an old, learned association firing in a context where it no longer serves any real protective purpose. Loosening perfectionism's grip starts with directly challenging the core belief, driving it, that your worth is contingent on flawless outcomes. This is best done not through abstract reassurance, but through direct, repeated evidence. The same evidence-based approach that rebuilds confidence more broadly. Each time you make an imperfect decision, and the world does not end, and the people who matter to you do not withdraw their care, and you are still fundamentally the same worthwhile person you were before the decision, you generate a small piece of counter-evidence against the old belief. Over enough repetitions, that belief, which was never actually true but simply deeply practiced, begins to lose its grip, the same way any well-worn neural pathway weakens when it stops being reinforced, and a new pathway is built in its place through repeated, contradicting experience. It's also worth explicitly separating perfectionism from genuinely high standards, because conflating the two often makes people reluctant to address this pattern, fearing that doing so would mean lowering the quality of their work or their decisions. High standards, held without the identity-level fear attached, actually tend to produce excellent outcomes precisely because they're not weighed down by the exhausting, self-protective machinery of perfectionism. Someone with healthy, high standards makes a decision, executes it well, and adjusts based on real feedback. Someone caught in perfectionism spends so much energy trying to preemptively eliminate any possibility of being wrong that the actual execution suffers from the sheer exhaustion of the process leading up to it. Releasing perfectionism doesn't mean releasing your standards. It means finally freeing up the energy your standards deserve. Instead of spending it on a fear that was never actually protecting the quality of your work in the first place, only the fragile self-image sitting underneath it. There's a particular exercise worth mentioning here, because many people find it quietly powerful the first time they try it honestly. Deliberately doing something imperfectly on purpose, in a low-stakes context, and observing what actually happens afterward. Send a message with a small typo, left uncorrected. Make a minor decision without weighing every option. Submit something good enough rather than exhaustively polished. Perfectionism thrives on the untested assumption that imperfection leads to catastrophe. And that assumption survives precisely because it's rarely tested directly. Deliberately testing it, in contexts small enough to feel safe, provides exactly the kind of direct, undeniable evidence that abstract reassurance never could, and it tends to be one of the fastest ways to begin genuinely loosening perfectionism's grip rather than simply understanding intellectually that it should be loosened. It's worth naming one final dimension of perfectionism that often goes unaddressed: the way it can quietly attach itself to the very process of overthinking itself. It's entirely possible to approach everything covered in this video: the decision deadlines, the evidence building, the identity work, with the same perfectionistic intensity that was driving the original problem, turning personal growth into just another arena where you must perform flawlessly or feel like you failed. If you notice yourself becoming anxious about not applying these tools perfectly, about missing a day of practice, about still catching yourself overthinking despite understanding all of this intellectually, recognize that reaction for exactly what it is: the same old pattern, simply wearing a new outfit. Progress here was never meant to be linear or flawless. It's meant to be a general trend, built through imperfect, inconsistent, genuinely human effort, applied repeatedly over time, which is the only kind of effort that was ever actually available to any of us in the first place, regardless of what perfectionism has spent years quietly insisting otherwise. There's also a useful distinction worth drawing between perfectionism aimed outward, at how your decisions and work will be judged by others, and perfectionism aimed inward, at an internal standard you hold yourself to regardless of anyone else's opinion. Both versions feed overthinking, but they often require slightly different responses. Outward-facing perfectionism tends to soften once you gather real evidence, through direct experience, that other people's judgments are far less harsh, far less attentive, and far less permanent than your anxious mind assumes. Inward-facing perfectionism, the kind that persists even in complete privacy, where no one else would ever know or judge the outcome, often points more directly toward that earlier discussed connection between worth and flawlessness, and tends to respond best to the deeper identity work covered throughout this video, rather than simply gathering more evidence about how others react. Recognizing which version is driving a particular instance of overthinking can help you apply the right tool rather than the wrong one, since reassurance about other people's opinions does little to address a standard you're holding entirely for your own private reasons. Chapter 14. Designing a life that makes decisiveness the default. Everything covered so far in this video works significantly better when it's supported by the environment you live inside every day, rather than relying purely on willpower exercised moment by moment. This final structural chapter is about designing your surroundings, your routines, and your habits, so that decisiveness becomes the path of least resistance rather than something you have to actively fight for against a current constantly pulling you back toward the old pattern. Start with the sheer volume of decisions you face on an average day, because this matters more than most people realize. Decision fatigue is a well-documented phenomenon. The quality and speed of your decision-making genuinely deteriorates over the course of a day as you accumulate more decisions, regardless of how significant any individual one is. This is precisely why so many highly effective people deliberately simplify low-stakes areas of their life, wearing similar outfits, eating similar meals, following consistent routines, not out of a lack of imagination, but because every decision eliminated from the trivial category preserves mental resources for the decisions that actually matter. If you're someone prone to overthinking, this principle is especially valuable because it directly reduces the raw number of opportunities your mind has each day to enter a spiral in the first place. Look honestly at your own routine and identify which small, recurring decisions could be simplified or automated, freeing up capacity that's currently being spent on choices that were never going to meaningfully affect your life either way. Your physical and digital environment also plays a larger role in this pattern than most people account for. Constant exposure to other people's curated decisions and outcomes, particularly through social media, tends to intensify comparison and second-guessing, feeding directly into the same uncertainty and self-doubt that fuels overthinking. This doesn't require eliminating these platforms entirely, but it's worth being honest with yourself about whether certain accounts, certain feeds, or certain habits of scrolling tend to leave you feeling more scattered and uncertain afterward, and adjusting your exposure accordingly. Similarly, a cluttered or chaotic physical environment has been shown to subtly increase cognitive load and stress, which lowers the threshold at which an anxious spiral can take hold. Small, consistent efforts toward an orderly environment aren't about aesthetics. They're about removing background noise that otherwise makes it easier for your mind to tip into the same looping pattern we've spent this entire video addressing. Build regular checkpoints into your week, not to add more analysis, but to consciously reinforce the identity and practices you've been building. A short weekly reflection, 10 minutes at most, reviewing where you acted decisively, where the old pattern resurfaced, and what you want to focus on in the coming days, keeps the entire system active and adapting rather than fading quietly into forgotten good intentions. The way most personal growth insights eventually do without some form of consistent structure holding them in place. This checkpoint should never turn into another arena for rumination. Keep it brief, keep it action-oriented, and close it, just as we discussed in the earlier chapter on productive reflection, with a clear next step rather than an open-ended spiral of self-assessment. It's also worth deliberately building small rituals around the transition into and out of decision-heavy periods of your day, because transitions are often where old patterns are most likely to resurface. A brief moment before a demanding meeting, a short walk after finishing a difficult task, a consistent wind-down routine before sleep that doesn't involve reviewing the day's unresolved thoughts. All of these create clear boundaries that help contain decision-making and reflection to their appropriate windows, rather than letting them bleed formlessly into every corner of your day the way unstructured overthinking tends to. These rituals don't need to be elaborate. Their value comes from consistency, not complexity, and from the simple signal they send to your nervous system that this particular period of activation or reflection has a defined beginning and a defined end. Finally, accept that designing this kind of life is itself an ongoing decision-making process, one that will occasionally require you to apply the exact tools covered throughout this video to the project of building the very system meant to support you. You will face moments of uncertainty about which habits are actually working, which routines need adjustment, which environmental changes are worth the effort. Apply a decision deadline to those questions too. Try an adjustment for a defined period, gather real evidence about whether it's serving you, and refine from there. The system doesn't need to be perfect from the outset. It needs to be built through the same decisive, evidence-based approach you're now applying to every other area of your life. Because ultimately, this entire framework was never really about overthinking specifically. It was always about learning to trust the process of living itself, imperfect information and all. Consider also the role that accountability, in a broader sense than what we discussed regarding work, can play in sustaining this entire system over time. Sharing your intention to build a more decisive relationship with your own mind, with someone you trust, a friend, a partner, even a small group of people working on something similar, creates a layer of external reinforcement that pure internal willpower often struggles to match on its own. This isn't about needing external validation to feel confident, which would simply reintroduce the same dependency on outside approval covered earlier in this video. It's about recognizing that humans are social creatures, and change tends to be more durable when it exists inside a supportive relational context rather than being carried entirely alone in private. Even a simple, occasional check-in, "How's this going for you?" can meaningfully strengthen a habit that might otherwise quietly erode under the pressure of a busy week. There's a broader principle underlying this entire chapter worth stating plainly. Environment design isn't a supplementary nice to have layered on top of the real psychological work. It is, in many respects, the mechanism that makes the psychological work sustainable at all. Insight alone, no matter how genuinely transformative it feels in the moment you first understand it, fades in the absence of supporting structure. This is precisely why so many people can watch or read something deeply resonant, feel a real shift in that moment, and find themselves back in the exact same pattern within a matter of weeks. The insight was never the missing piece. The missing piece was always the structure that turns a single moment of clarity into a sustained, repeated practice, until that practice eventually stops requiring conscious effort altogether and simply becomes how you naturally operate. Chapter 15. The life waiting on the other side of the loop. Take a moment and imagine, honestly, what your life would look like if the loop we've spent this entire video examining simply stopped running. Not perfect certainty about every choice. That was never realistic and was never actually the goal. Just the absence of that constant, low hum of second-guessing that's been quietly narrating your days for as long as you can remember. Imagine sending the message without rereading it 6 times. Imagine making a decision at work and moving on to the next task instead of replaying it for the rest of the afternoon. Imagine lying down at night and actually falling asleep, instead of running through the day's conversations, searching for evidence that you said something wrong. This isn't a fantasy reserved for people who are naturally calmer or naturally more confident than you. Every tool covered in this video exists precisely because the loop is not a fixed trait. It's a pattern built through repetition, sustained by a nervous system responding to old signals of threat that no longer accurately reflect the actual risk of the decisions in front of you. Patterns built through repetition can be dismantled through repetition too, not through a single dramatic moment of change, but through the accumulation of small, deliberate choices, the same way the original pattern accumulated in the first place, just moving in a new direction now instead of the old one. It's worth being honest, one final time, about what this process will actually feel like, because false expectations tend to derail progress faster than almost anything else. There will be a Tuesday afternoon, weeks or months from now, where an old decision resurfaces the familiar pull towards spiraling. And for a moment, it will feel exactly as automatic and consuming as it always has. That moment is not a sign of failure. It is simply the old pathway, still present, still occasionally activated under enough stress or fatigue, exactly as the science covered earlier in this video would predict. The difference, the entire measure of everything you will have built by then, is not the absence of that pull. It's the length of time it takes you to notice it, name it, and choose differently anyway. That gap between the automatic pull and your conscious response to it is where all of the real change actually lives. And it tends to grow shorter and shorter the more consistently you practice closing it. Think back to where we started. The lie that overthinking was protecting you. The silent erosion it caused to your confidence. One unnoticed hesitation at a time. The biological mechanism running underneath it. An amygdala and a default mode network doing exactly what they were built to do, just in a modern context where the stakes are rarely what they once were. The way it hollowed out your peace of mind, turning even quiet moments into extensions of an ongoing internal negotiation that never actually resolved anything. And the way confidence and overthinking fed each other, tightening into a spiral that felt, for a long time, like simply who you were rather than something you were doing. And then everything that came after that recognition. The decision deadline that finally gave your mind a boundary it had never been offered before. The slow, deliberate rebuilding of trust in your own judgment. One small decision at a time, treated as legitimate evidence, regardless of how minor it seemed. The physical tools that calm the body first, so the mind actually has the conditions it needs to think clearly rather than fighting an uphill battle against its own biology. The identity shift from someone who hesitates to someone who decides, sustained not through a single insight but through consistent, recognized action. The distinction between reflection that moves you forward and rumination that simply keeps you circling. The specific ways this pattern shows up in relationships and at work, and the perfectionism so often sitting quietly underneath all of it, waiting to be named and finally challenged. And the environment, the habits, the structure that makes all of this sustainable long after the motivation of hearing it for the first time inevitably fades into the background of ordinary daily life. None of this requires you to become a different person. It requires you to stop reinforcing a pattern that was never actually you in the first place, just something you learned, understandably, as a way to feel safe in an uncertain world. That pattern can be unlearned, not overnight, and not without moments where the old loop resurfaces and pulls at you, because it will. But every single time you catch it, interrupt it, and choose a small act of decisive trust in yourself instead, you are building something sturdier underneath you than the loop ever was. You are becoming the version of yourself that this video described at the very beginning. The one who sleeps peacefully, who speaks without rehearsing every word, who trusts their own judgment enough to move forward without needing certainty first. That version of you is not a distant aspiration. They are built one decision at a time, starting with the very next one in front of you. The only question left is whether you'll let this be information you simply understood, or the moment you finally started living differently. The choice, as it always was, is yours to make. And you don't need to overthink it.